The morning Vera Stillman stood at the center of the Harwick Grange Hall with 250 cartons of eggs stacked behind her, and the whole desperate county watching. The air inside smelled of sawdust and human want. It was the kind of heat that had no business living inside a building, a heat that pressed against the windows from outside and breathed through every crack in the siding, a heat that had been building since the first week of June and had not once relented in the 11 weeks since. Men who had farmed the same ground their fathers broke stood with their hats in their hands, and Vera noticed that particular detail. The hats, because in all the months since she had come to Harwick County, not one of those men had removed his hat in her presence or taken any gesture of respect that she could name. Gerald Foss stood at the far end of the hall beside his associate from the Meridian Agricultural Cooperative, both of them in clean shirts that had never absorbed a day's honest sweat, and Gerald's smile had the same quality it always carried, which was warmth performing the function of a blade. Vera set her hands flat on the folding table in front of her, and looked out at the crowd and said nothing for a long moment, because she had learned by then that silence was a thing the land had taught her, and she had come to trust it absolutely. The real verdict, she understood, had not been cast this morning. It had been cast many months ago, in the mud of early March, by a flock of birds. Everyone in the county had already written off as dead. She had arrived in Harwick in the second week of February, driving a truck so old the heater worked only when it chose to, pulling a single-axle trailer that held the sum of what she owned after the sale of her mother's house in another state was divided by her debts, and the remainder divided again by the cost of the journey. She had $2,400. She had a folded clipping from an agricultural paper about a farmstead with 12 acres coming available on a county road 6 miles south of town, and she had a general reputation, among the people who had known her before, for being steady if not spectacular. She was 31 years old. She had grown up helping her mother tend a kitchen garden and had spent the last 4 years working in a commercial greenhouse operation 3 counties away, learning how growing things behaved when they were crowded, underfed, and ignored, which turned out to be a surprisingly practical education. She had no husband, no partner, no family within 400 miles. She drove into Harwick on a Tuesday, and by Thursday she had signed papers on the 12-acre place for $1,800, most of which was going toward the mineral rights that the previous tenant had let revert to the original survey, and which came with a farmhouse that needed a new roof on the back third and a well that the property inspector described in his report as viable with monitoring, which Vera understood to mean unreliable but present. The egg operation she learned about on the Saturday of that same week at the Feed and Supply on the county road. A commercial layer farm 20 miles north had completed a full flock rotation, meaning they had culled their spent hens, every bird that had passed its peak production window, and rather than process them at cost, the operation had decided to sell the lot to whoever would haul them by the following Monday. 250 birds. The asking price was 6 cents per bird, which came to $15 for the flock. The man at the feed counter mentioned this in the same tone he might use to describe a municipal nuisance, a clog in a culvert, something to be cleared away. Spent layers, he said, do not lay. That being the whole of the subject as far as he was concerned, they ate feed and produced nothing. They were not meat birds and their carcasses were stringy and commercially worthless. What any person would want with 250 spent hens was a question he said he could not answer, and he laughed when he said it, and the 2 other men at the counter laughed with him. Vera drove the 20 miles north on Sunday afternoon with the trailer and came back by dark with 250 white leghorn hens crowded into temporary wire crates, and she had paid $15 for them out of her remaining $600, which left her $585 to her name, a sum that had to cover feed, roof repairs, seed for the kitchen garden, and every contingency the land might invent between February and any first income she could imagine generating. She did not sleep much that first night, not because of anxiety exactly, but because the arithmetic kept her awake the way a low sound will, insisting on her attention. $585. roughly $49 per month if she needed the money to last 12 months. The hens needed feed. Feed was not $49 a month for 250 birds. She lay in the farmhouse on a cot with a wool blanket her mother had owned for 30 years. And she worked the numbers in the dark, and the numbers did not resolve into comfort. By the end of the first week, he understood what everyone in the county already believed they understood, which was that spent hens were, in the main, done. Of the 250 birds she had brought home, she collected a total of 11 eggs in 7 days. She cracked 2 to check the quality and found them good, with bright dense yolks, but 2 eggs did not constitute a business. She spent the better part of each morning moving through the converted equipment shed she had fitted with roost bars and nesting boxes, checking each bird by hand for condition, for parasites, for the particular lethargic drooping that meant irreversible organ stress. She lost 9 birds in the first 2 weeks, birds that had been too far gone when she bought them, and she buried each one at the edge of the property, with less ceremony than guilt because she had not known them yet. The remaining 241 birds ate feed, drank water, moved in their slow, bovine, quiet way through the shed, and offered nothing in return except their continued breathing, which Vera told herself was a form of faith if she was in a generous mood, and a form of stubbornness if she was not. Gerald Foss came to the property in the 3rd week of February. She saw his truck from the kitchen window while she was eating crackers and a canned soup she had bought in a case of 12 because the per-unit cost worked out, and she watched him walk toward the door with the particular confidence of a man who has never been turned away from anything. He represented the Meridian Agricultural Cooperative, which held grain contracts on most of the county's working farms and had recently begun acquiring egg production operations across a 3-county radius. He was, perhaps, 55. With good teeth and a voice that knew exactly how warm to be. He told her he had heard she had picked up the Larson place on the county road, and he was glad someone was going to put it to work. And had she had time to think about her production goals, she told him she was still in the setup phase. He told her that Meridian had resources that could help a new producer get established quickly, contracts and credit lines and technical support, and that he would hate to see a newcomer struggle through a learning curve that Meridian's experience could flatten right out. She thanked him and said she would think about it. He told her he'd heard she'd picked up the spent hen lot from the Callaway operation, and he paused here with a particular quality of pause, a pause that was itself a kind of smile, and he said that was a bold decision, and she could hear in bold the word he had not used, which was foolish. He said if the birds turned out to be more than she could manage, Meridian had a disposal contract with a rendering facility. Then he named a figure at which Meridian would be willing to purchase her operation, all 12 acres, the farmhouse, the equipment shed, and all 250 birds, a figure of $4,000, which was $2,200 more than she had paid for the land and $15 more than she had paid for the birds. And he said he thought that was fair for a place with a roof that needed work and a well with monitoring requirements. She told him she'd think about it. He said he would be in touch. She did not sleep easily after that either, but for a different reason. Old Marta Vazari's place was a quarter-mile east along the same county road, and Vera had passed it a dozen times without knowing anything about the woman inside, except that the garden beds along the south face of the house were attended with a precision that suggested long practice and strong opinions. Marta came to Vera on a morning in early March, walking the quarter-mile with a covered dish of something that smelled of cabbage and bay leaf, and she sat at Vera's kitchen table without being asked and looked at Vera for a moment with dark eyes that had the quality of long patience, and then she said, one in an accent that had not fully released its Hungarian origins in what Vera estimated were 60 years of American residence, the birds are not finished. They are only confused, Vera said. Confused how? Marta said they have been inside machines for 2 years. Bright lights and timed feed and manufactured days. They do not know the real light yet, and they do not know what season lives inside them. You must teach them the season. Not force it, she said. Teach it. Vera said she wasn't sure she understood. Marta set down her fork and said, The ground remembers everything. The seed forgets. Your job is to let the ground speak and keep yourself quiet enough to hear it. She said it plainly, not as a riddle, but as a description of a technical process. She had observed work across several decades. She told Vera that the birds' laying cycles had been artificially compressed and then abruptly interrupted, and that their bodies needed a period of genuine, seasonal rhythm, real light and real dark, real cold and real warmth in the correct sequence, before they would resume. She said two things with total calm certainty. The birds would lay again, and they would lay better than they had in the commercial operation if the conditions were right. Because birds allowed to follow genuine seasonal rhythm produced eggs with superior yolk density and shell integrity. A fact she said she had known since she was a girl in a village where nobody had electricity, and the hens simply did what hens do without anyone's assistance. She said Vera should open the shed to morning light immediately, extend the birds' outdoor access, and let the natural lengthening of March days do the work. She also said, do not tell anyone until you have something to tell. Vera sat with that for a moment and then said, You think it will work? Marta said, I have never seen it not work if the person waiting has patience. Then she picked up her fork again, and they ate in comfortable quiet. The boy appeared in the second week of March, at the corner of the equipment shed, standing as if he had simply grown there from a previous visit no one had recorded. He was 10 years old, with the name Denny Obrey, and his family rented a house 2 fields over from a landlord who was behind on the property taxes and took this out on the rental agreement in ways that were not legal but were difficult to contest. Denny did not ask to help. He simply began helping, moving quietly through the flock with a facility that surprised her, lifting birds gently and checking their feet, refilling water troughs, noting in the particular unself-conscious way of children which birds were doing what. He named the birds without her permission, and without apparent concern for whether she approved. He named a large, calm hen at the center of the flock Adelaide. And Adelaide did seem to have some organizing function within the group, some quality of settled authority that the other birds attended to. And once Vera accepted the name, she found herself using it without irony. Then he told her one afternoon, as plainly as Marta had told her the ground remembers. Adelaide is waiting for something. She doesn't seem worried about it, though. Vera said, What do you think she's waiting for? Then he said, I think she's waiting for it to be spring. He was right, or Adelaide was right, or the land was right, in the way Marta had meant. In the last week of March, on a morning with real warmth in it for the first time, Vera went into the shed and found 43 eggs. The following morning, 61. By the first week of April, the flock was averaging 170 eggs per day, rising toward 200, and the eggs had the exact quality Marta had described. Shells with a weight and density that commercial eggs lacked, yolks that held their dome when broken into a pan, a richness that was not a matter of sentiment, but of measurable composition. Vera gathered the eggs, packed them carefully in second-hand cartons she had cleaned and relabeled by hand. And she told no one. She did the arithmetic quietly in the farmhouse at night, and the arithmetic, for the first time since she had arrived in Harwick, resolved into something that was not crisis. At 200 eggs per day, she had roughly 16 dozen per day, 112 dozen per week. If she could sell them at even 60 cents a dozen above the commercial rate, which was a modest ambition given the quality, she was looking at an income that covered feed and left a margin. She wrote the number down and sat with it and felt the specific quality of calm that comes not from comfort, but from having crossed a threshold. She kept the coal banked low under the ash. She sold quietly to the 2 restaurants in the next town, over to a handful of households who had heard by word of mouth and asked her directly. She priced them fairly and did not advertise. Gerald Foss drove by twice in April, and she waved from the yard and he waved back, and she could see from the road that the shed looked the same as it always had, and she hoped he saw a woman who was struggling quietly, which was more or less what she had been, just not anymore. The outside confirmation arrived in the third week of May in the form of a man named Cleve Durant, who cooked at a fine dining restaurant in a city 80 miles away and who was driving through the county buying local product for a summer menu. He had been directed to Vera by one of the town restaurants, and he arrived at the property in a small, clean car and introduced himself with a formality that was respectful rather than condescending. He cracked one of her eggs over a saucer she brought from the kitchen and looked at it for a moment without speaking. And then he said he would take 200 dozen immediately and as many as she could provide on a bi-weekly basis through the season. He paid her 90 cents a dozen above the commercial rate, a premium she had not asked for because he said the quality warranted it and he was not in the habit of paying less than a thing was worth. He gave her a handshake and his card and drove away. And Vera stood in the yard for a moment with the check in her hand and the heat building around her, and felt something that was not quite triumph, because triumph implies a contest, and she had not been in contest with anything except the arithmetic. June arrived, and the heat arrived with it. And then the heat did not leave. By the second week of June, the county extension office had issued a drought advisory. By the third week, the county had lost its advisory status and moved to a formal drought declaration, and by the first week of July the situation had the character Marta had once described to her, sitting at the kitchen table in May, when she had said, "Sometimes the sky closes its fist and everything below must wait." This drought had the character of a closed fist. The conventional laying operations in the county, which ran on the same commercial model the Callaway farm had used, began to fail in sequence. Commercial layers require precise climate control, precise humidity, precise light. When power costs spike to run coolers through weeks of 100-degree temperatures, margins collapse. Several operations suspended production. One sold its entire flock in July and contracted with Meridian to lease the infrastructure for grain storage. The county's local egg supply dropped sharply and then dropped again. Vera's flock held. The white leghorns, having spent their recovery in genuine seasonal conditions, had developed the particular physiological resilience that comes from following real rhythms rather than manufactured ones. They still needed shade and water and management through the worst of the heat, and Vera provided those things with the same patient daily labor she had always provided, rising before light and working until she could not, and Denny came every morning and helped without being asked. The production dipped in the worst weeks to 140 eggs per day, 120, but it did not stop. The arithmetic changed again, but it did not collapse. She was still in the middle of what the radio called the worst drought in the county's recorded history, producing eggs. The county around her was not. Gerald Foss came in July, and this time he did not bring warmth. His smile was the same, but the mechanism behind it was different now, more like a tool being applied with intent rather than being offered. He told her that Meridian had become the county's primary egg procurement agent given the supply disruption, and that they were in a position to offer her a procurement contract that would guarantee her a stable price through the summer. He said the stable price would be the pre-drought commercial rate, which was now 60 cents per dozen below what the market had moved to, given scarcity. She said she had other arrangements. He said those arrangements might become difficult to maintain given logistical pressures on independent producers in a crisis period. She said she appreciated his concern. He said Meridian's original acquisition offer for the property and flock still stood. She said it did not interest her. He said the county planning office had flagged a question about the well certification on her property, a question that would likely require a formal inspection, and those inspections had a backlog currently of 8 to 10 weeks. He said this with the voice of a man passing along information, which is the voice of a man delivering a threat in the form of information. She thanked him and walked him to his truck. That evening, she called the county planning office and spoke to a clerk who confirmed that there was indeed a newly opened question about her well certification, filed 2 days previously by a third party, and that an inspection could be scheduled but the clerk also said the filing was flagged as potentially procedural, given the timing, meaning filed during a declared emergency which triggered different rules about enforcement timelines. She wrote this down. She also noted that the Meridian filing had referenced her well's monitoring status from the original property inspection, a document that had not been part of any public filing. She wrote that down too. Ellsworth Crane had been the loudest voice in the county in February on the subject of Vera Stillman and her spent hens. He had been at the feed counter the morning she wasn't there, the morning after she had driven to the Callaway farm, and he had apparently reconstructed the enterprise with perfect comic contempt, performing it for whoever would listen. He ran a 160-acre grain and poultry operation east of town, generally profitable, and he had the kind of confidence that comes from long, unbroken competence, which is a reasonable thing to have until conditions change. The drought had changed the conditions. His 3,000 commercial layers had been partially shut down in July to control cooling costs. His corn was not going to make yield. He had obligations coming due in September that had been reasonable in May and were frightening in August. He came to Vera's property on a Tuesday morning in early August with his hat in his hands, literally held against his stomach with both of his large rough hands, and he said he needed to ask her something. She opened the gate and let him come to the yard. He stood for a moment looking at the shed, where the sounds of 241 productive hens were perfectly audible, and his face did a thing she did not comment on. He said he had a family that needed to eat, and he was short of eggs and cash both, and he heard she might have a surplus. He said he could not pay the market rate. He named a lower figure with visible difficulty. She looked at him for a moment, and she thought about the morning at the feed counter that she had heard about secondhand, and she thought about what Marta had said once about the ground remembering that the ground keeps accounts we cannot see, and she thought about the fact that she was not the ground and was not required to collect those accounts the way the ground would. She named a price that was fair. It was not charity, and it was not cruelty. It was the price of the eggs. He nodded, and she went into the shed and filled 2 flats and handed them to him, and he paid her, and he said, with the particular difficulty of a man performing an unfamiliar operation, "I was not right about you." She said, "I know." That was the whole of it. The Harwick Range meeting on the 12th of August had been called by the county commissioner's office to discuss emergency food supply for the region, and Gerald Foss had arranged, through Meridian's County Procurement Authority, to chair the supply portion of the agenda. He had spent the preceding 2 weeks acquiring or contracting the egg production of every small operator in the county who was still producing, which, as of the 2nd week of August, was 1 operator, which was Vera Stillman. He had purchased their contracts, not their production, meaning he had positioned Meridian as the sole distribution point for whatever she produced. What he had not fully accounted for was that her production was her production, and she had not signed a Meridian contract, and the contracts he had purchased were from operations that had contracted with Meridian directly. He had, in his diligence, also provided written correspondence to a county planning contact referencing the monitoring status of a specific private well on the county road south of town, documentation that she had not shared and had not been in any public file. She had asked the planning office how Meridian had known the specific language of her original inspection report, and they had confirmed the language matched precisely. She had copied that confirmation to the county commissioner's legal office 3 days before the Grange meeting, and she had brought a copy with her to the meeting inside a plain file folder. The hall was full. The heat was full, too. Gerald Foss stood at the front and began the supply portion of the meeting by describing Meridian's preparedness to serve as the county's emergency egg distribution point, and he described the arrangement with the warmth he brought to every transaction as a service, a community resource, a cooperative effort. He named a distribution price that was the current market rate plus a 15% emergency handling fee, which was the price of scarcity translated into Meridian's margin. He looked across the room at Vera and gave her a particular nod, which was the nod of a man who believes he holds every card. She walked to the front with her 250 cartons and her file folder, and she set the folder on the table, and she said she would like to address the supply portion of the agenda directly. She told the meeting that the eggs in the cartons behind her represented the current surplus production of her operation, which she had brought to this meeting because she thought the county ought to see that a supply existed and could be managed locally without a 15% handling fee. She said she would like to sell those cartons to whoever needed them at cost, which she named as a specific figure per dozen, a figure that was fair and that covered her production costs with a modest margin, and that was 42 cents a dozen below what Meridian had proposed. She said she was not in a position to supply the entire county's needs indefinitely from one flock of hens, but that she was willing to work with other producers who were looking at rebuilding their operations to share what she had learned about seasonal rehabilitation of spent laying stock, which she said could be acquired for very little money currently and restored to productive condition in a reasonably short period, and she said she knew this for certain because she had done it. She said she wanted to discuss the well certification matter that had been filed against her property, and she opened the file folder and described what it contained quietly and without theatrical emphasis, in the same tone she might use to read a ledger. She said the language in Meridian's planning office correspondence matched the language in her private inspection report with specificity that could not be coincidental, and she said the county commissioner's legal office had a copy of this documentation, and she understood they would be looking into the matter. The silence that followed had a texture. Gerald Foss's warmth left the room the way light leaves when a cloud crosses the sun. Not gradually, but completely. He said something about standard research practices and public record accessibility, and the words sounded like what they were, which was a man encountering the specific geometry of his own overreach. Ellsworth Crane, who was sitting in the third row with his hat now off again, said in a carrying voice that if the planning filing turned out to have been filed under false pretense, he hoped the proper parties would answer for it, and several other voices in the room made sounds of agreement. Gerald Foss gathered his papers with the careful movements of a man who knows the room has turned and is performing calm to avoid confirming it, and he and his associate left the hall, and the door closed, and there was a long breath in the room that felt like the first real breath anyone had taken since June. Vera sold every carton in the hall for what she had named, and she wrote down the names of 6 producers who came to speak to her afterward about the spent hen rehabilitation method, and she told them what Marta had told her, and what the birds had taught her, and what the land had confirmed, and she told them the arithmetic was favorable if they were patient. Denny Obrey stood at the edge of the room through all of it, watching with his particular quality of watchfulness, and when Vera came to where he was standing, he said, "Adelaide laid a double yoker this morning. I kept it for you." Vera said, "I know she did. That bird has always known what morning it is." Marta Vazzari came to the farm on the first morning of September, which was the morning the sky opened for the first time in 11 weeks. She came under the rain, without a coat, and stood in the yard and looked at the shed and the garden, which had kept itself alive through the drought, because Vera had mulched it heavily in June on Marta's advice, trapping what moisture the ground remembered. Marta said, with the rain coming down on both of them, "The ground held what you gave it." Vera said, "You told me it would." Marta said, "I told you to listen. You did the holding." They stood in the rain in the yard for a while, and the hens came out of the shed into the wet grass, Adelaide first and then the others, and they moved across the yard in the particular way of creatures who know weather as a language, and were now hearing a word they had been waiting for. The 12 acres smelled of what rain smells like when it falls on ground that has been waiting seriously, which is a smell that has nothing to do with relief and everything to do with continuation. Vera was still not comfortable exactly, still not finished with any of the work, still carrying the arithmetic in her head as a habit she had not been able to set down. But the numbers resolved now the way they had been refusing to resolve since February. And she stood in the yard of her own 12 acres in the county of her own choosing, and felt the specific weight of what it means to be not a newcomer, not a woman alone out on that road, but simply a person who had listened to the right things in the right silence, and had chosen to remain. By the following spring, 4 other operations in the county had acquired spent hen lots and were in various stages of the seasonal rehabilitation cycle. Fiora had spent 2 Saturdays in February walking those producers through the method, showing them how to read a bird's condition by handling rather than by production metrics, how to sequence the light exposure, how to watch for the particular settling behavior that meant the flock was beginning to orient to real season rather than manufactured schedule. She charged nothing for this. She had what she needed. The ground held what she had given it, and she had learned from Marta and from Adelaide and from 235 birds who had been written off as finished and were not finished at all, that what a thing is worth is not a fixed quantity, but a living one, patient and responsive and truer than any figure a man in a clean shirt writes down without asking the land's permission. The arithmetic, she had started telling the producers who came to her, is only honest when the land is part of the equation. Everything else is somebody's guess about what you don't know. She said it the way Marta said things, plainly as the description of a process she had observed. Work, and she said it to each of them as the first thing, before the specifics, because she had learned that the specifics only land correctly if the listener understands first that the ground is a party to every calculation, and that it never forgets what has been asked of it and what has been offered in return.